The night my ex-wife's lawyer called, I was eating leftover chili from a pot I'd made 3 days earlier. Sitting at my kitchen table in Boise, the kind of quiet around me that only men living alone in their 60s really understand. The radiator knocked twice, then stopped. Outside, snow was starting to come down in the way it does in early March. Not dramatic, just steady, like it had a job to do and intended to finish it. I almost didn't answer. I didn't recognize the number. I'm glad I did. My name doesn't matter much to this story, but the roles do. I was a husband once, a father, a structural engineer who spent 31 years making sure buildings didn't fall down. I was good at that job. I understood load-bearing walls, stress tolerances, the invisible lines where pressure becomes too much and something gives way. It turns out I understood those things a lot better in concrete and steel than I ever did in a marriage. My ex-wife and I divorced 11 years ago. We'd been together for 23 years before that, which is long enough that the ending didn't feel like a door closing so much as a whole wing of the house being sealed off. You don't stop loving someone like that all at once. You just stop being able to reach them. We had one daughter. She was 34 at the time of the call. She worked for her mother's real estate development firm, had for 9 years, and she had made it very clear, in the way that adult children sometimes do when they've chosen sides and calcified around that choice, that I was not a welcome part of her life. The last time my daughter spoke to me at any length was at a birthday dinner for my granddaughter, who had just turned 7. My daughter sat across the table from me and smiled at the child and helped her blow out candles and barely said 10 words in my direction the entire evening. When I hugged my granddaughter goodbye in the driveway, my daughter stood at the door with her arms crossed, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of the particular coldness that comes from a version of events you've been told so many times it becomes the only version you can see. I drove home that night thinking, this is how it ends, not with a fight, just with a closed door and a 7-year-old waving from a driveway. My ex-wife had built something remarkable after we divorced. She'd always been the one with business instincts. I was the one who understood how structures held together, and she was the one who understood how deals got made. After the divorce, she took the small property management company she'd started during our marriage, and over 11 years turned it into one of the larger privately held real estate development firms in the Pacific Northwest. Office buildings, mixed-use residential, 2 hotel conversions in Portland, the kind of success that generates its own gravity. She was 61 when she was diagnosed, pancreatic cancer, which is the kind of diagnosis that doesn't offer much in the way of negotiation. She was gone 14 months after that. I didn't go to the funeral. I thought about it. We had been married for 23 years. We had a daughter together. There were moments between us that I still carry. The way you carry certain objects from a house you've had to leave. Not because they're valuable to anyone else, but because they're yours. But my daughter had made it clear, through channels, that my presence would not be welcome. So I stayed in Boise, and I ate leftover chili, and I let the snow come down. The lawyer's name was a man I'll call Mr. Hartley. He was a partner at a firm in Seattle that specialized in estate law, and he had the kind of voice that sounds like it went to a good school and has never been raised in anger. He asked if I was sitting down. I told him I was eating. He said that might be fine, that the news wasn't bad, exactly, but that it was likely to be surprising, and that he wanted to make sure I understood that what he was about to tell me was real and not a mistake, and had been through 2 rounds of legal review. I put down my spoon. He told me that my ex-wife had revised her will 14 months before her death, shortly after her diagnosis. The original will, the one she'd had in place for several years, had left the entirety of her estate, valued in the final accounting at approximately $218 million, including the company, real estate holdings, and liquid assets, to our daughter. The revised will was different. The company, the commercial holdings, and the bulk of the liquid assets, roughly $194 million in total, were left to me, not to a foundation, not in trust for my granddaughter. To me, directly, along with a letter from my ex-wife that was to be read at the formal reading of the will, in the presence of all named parties. Our daughter was left the 2 properties she'd always said she loved most, the lake house and the condo in Portland, and a check for $10,000. I sat in my kitchen in Boise for a long time after he finished speaking. The radiator knocked again. The snow kept coming down. I need to tell you something about the last 3 years of our marriage, because without it, none of the rest makes sense. My ex-wife's company nearly collapsed in 2009. This wasn't unusual. A lot of real estate businesses came apart during that period, and hers had been overextended in ways that the crash made suddenly and catastrophically visible. But the way she chose to manage that crisis is what mattered. There was a construction contract, a city contract actually, for a public mixed-use development in Tacoma that had been awarded to a competitor. My ex-wife had bid on it. She'd wanted it badly, and when she didn't get it, she didn't accept the outcome. What she did instead, I didn't know about until later. She had someone on the inside, a man who owed her a professional favor, alter the bid documentation. Not dramatically, just enough to disqualify the winning bid on a technicality. The contract was reopened. Her company won it. It saved her financially at a moment when the alternative was bankruptcy. I found out by accident. A file left open on a laptop, a name I recognized. Numbers that didn't match the story I'd been told. I confronted her. She didn't deny it. She was past that. She was already in crisis management mode, which for her meant being direct about what had happened and immediately calculating what needed to happen next. She told me that if it came out, she'd lose everything. The company, the contract, the reputation, possibly more. And she told me that our daughter, who had just joined the company, who had moved back from Boston to be part of what her mother was building, would lose everything with her. I want you to understand something. My daughter and I were close then, before everything changed. She used to call me on Sunday mornings. She'd been my kid in a way that's hard to articulate without sounding maudlin. The one who wanted to come to my job sites when she was little, who asked me to explain how bridges worked, who cried at my retirement party in a way that embarrassed us both, and that I have thought about nearly every day since. I was 61 years old, and I was already planning to retire. My career was finished, my reputation was, in the practical sense of my remaining years, not something I needed to protect the way a younger man would. So I made a decision that I have spent a great deal of time with since. I told my ex-wife that I would say the bid alteration had been my idea, that I had done it without her knowledge, that she'd had no part in it. She told me I was out of my mind. I told her she was probably right, but that I'd made up my mind. The investigation took 8 months. I cooperated fully, which is to say I told a story that was partially true in its details and entirely false in its attribution. The man who'd made the alterations confirmed that he'd been approached by someone. He said it was me. I didn't dispute it. My ex-wife and I divorced during that period. I think she wanted to, genuinely. I think she couldn't stand looking at what I was doing for her. Or maybe she needed the distance from me to function. I've thought about both possibilities enough that I can no longer tell them apart. My daughter was told by her mother that I had done it, that the decision had been mine, that her mother had been as shocked as anyone. I was disbarred from engineering, my license revoked, my professional membership ended. I was sentenced to 16 months in federal prison, of which I served 11. Fraud, bid tampering, interference with a public contract. My name appeared in 3 newspapers and 1 regional business magazine. I served my time at a minimum security facility in Oregon. I did not reach out to my daughter during that period. I had nothing to say to her that wouldn't have required me to explain the truth, and I had decided the truth was not something she needed. When I was released, I moved to Boise. I had enough saved that I didn't need to work. I got a small house. I started walking every morning along the Boise River. I read more than I had in 30 years. I watched my granddaughter grow up, mostly through photographs. My son-in-law occasionally texted me when my daughter wasn't looking, a kindness I have never forgotten. My ex-wife and I spoke twice after the divorce, both times briefly. Both times she sounded like someone who was trying to say something and kept stopping herself. I never asked her to. I figured whatever she was carrying, she'd earned it. The formal reading of the will took place 3 weeks after Mr. Hartley's call in a conference room in a law office in Seattle that had the muted, expensive quality of a place accustomed to delivering life-altering information to people who had been asked to sit down first. My daughter was there when I arrived. I hadn't seen her in 2 years. She looked like her mother around the eyes. She always had, and she looked at me the way you look at something unexpected in a room you expected to have to yourself. She had brought her husband, which I was glad for. He's a decent man. He'd always been quietly kind to me in the way of someone caught between competing loyalties, and I didn't hold it against him that he couldn't do more. She didn't speak to me directly. She said something to him in a low voice. Then she looked at her phone. Mr. Hartley was efficient. He went through the will's provisions clearly and without editorializing. When he reached the section concerning the distribution of the primary estate, the company, the holdings, the accounts, he paused once, briefly, in the way of someone who has delivered difficult news before and knows the value of giving people half a second to understand what they're hearing before the next sentence lands. My daughter's expression when he finished that section was not something I'll describe in any detail. I'll only say that she's her mother's daughter, and she pulled herself together faster than most people would have. Then Mr. Hartley said that the will included a letter to be read aloud at this meeting, and that he had been asked to read it in full. He put on his glasses. He picked up the paper. My ex-wife wrote the way she'd always talked, direct, spare, no detours. She began by addressing our daughter by name. She said that she had spent years telling herself that silence was protection, and that she had only recently understood. Sitting in a hospital room with a diagnosis she wasn't going to survive, that silence is sometimes just cowardice wearing better clothes. She explained everything. The bid. The man she'd asked to alter the documents. Her role in every decision. She said that when these investigations started, she had not known what my plan was until I told her. She said she had told me it was insane, and that I'd told her it was already done in my mind, and that there was nothing she could say to change it. She said she had let me do it. She said she had told our daughter a version of events that was a lie. That I had not orchestrated what had happened. That I had, in fact, dismantled my own life to prevent her from losing hers, and to protect our daughter's position in a company that our daughter had given up her life in Boston to be part of. She said, I told myself I'd find a way to make it right. I told myself that so many times it started to sound like truth. The years went by, and I kept telling it to myself, and doing nothing, which is its own kind of theft. Stealing time from someone who deserved better, and calling it good intentions. She said that she had changed her will because she didn't know another way to say what she needed to say. That money was the only language she'd ever spoken fluently, that she hoped I would forgive her, not for her sake, but because she didn't want me to carry the weight of not forgiving someone who no longer existed to receive it. She ended by saying something to our daughter. I won't repeat all of it, but the last line was, He chose you. He chose you when I wasn't strong enough to. Please don't make his choice mean nothing. Mr. Hartley took off his glasses. The room was very quiet. My daughter left before I did. Her husband caught my eye on the way out, just for a moment, just long enough for me to understand that he knew more than he'd ever said, and that he had carried that quietly too. I nodded. He nodded back. Then they were gone. I sat in that conference room for a while after. Mr. Hartley gave me space, which I appreciated. He brought me a glass of water I didn't drink. He said there were documents to sign, and that there was no rush, and that we could schedule a follow-up for the following week. I thanked him. I put on my coat. I took the elevator down and walked out into the Seattle gray, the kind of sky that can't decide between rain and cloud and ultimately becomes both. I walked for a long time, past the waterfront, along the path above the water where people were walking dogs and pushing strollers and living the ordinary days that make up a life. I found a bench and sat on it and looked at the sound for a while. I thought about the 11 months I'd spent in Oregon, the particular texture of that time, not dramatic, not the way it is in movies, just very slow and very small and lit by fluorescent light that was always the same no matter what time of day it was. I thought about the morning I walked out and how the sun was doing something specific with the clouds that I've never been able to fully describe to anyone, just that it looked like the world was still there and still working. I thought about my daughter, about the Sunday morning calls that stopped, about her face at my granddaughter's birthday dinner, the studied distance of it, the way she'd learned to be in the same room as me without being in the same room as me. I thought about my ex-wife, dying in a hospital room and writing a letter, putting into words at the end what she hadn't been able to say for 11 years. I didn't feel what I thought I would feel. I'd spent enough time in the last decade preparing for the possibility that things would never change that I'd somehow failed to prepare for the possibility that they might. My daughter called 4 days later. I was on my morning walk along the river. Ice still on the edges, but the middle moving, the way it does in early March when spring is still theoretical but present, I answered. She didn't say hello. She said, I need you to know that I'm not calling because of the money. I said I knew that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I don't know how to do this. I said, I know. Me neither. She said she'd been on the phone with her husband for 3 hours the night before. that she'd read her mother's letter 4 times, that she'd thought about calling me and not called, and then thought about it again, and finally her husband had taken her phone and pressed my name and handed it back to her. I made a note to thank him properly someday. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about that question for a while. I was still walking. A dog came past me on the path, a yellow lab, who had no interest in me at all, and I watched it go. I said, "Because you were 23 years old, and you'd moved your whole life back home to build something with your mother, and I couldn't take that from you without taking everything from you. I wasn't willing to do that." She said, "That wasn't your choice to make." I said, "You're right. It wasn't." Neither of us said anything for a while. Then she said, "I wasted 11 years being angry at you." I said, "You weren't wrong to be angry. You were just angry at the wrong thing." She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else. I've heard that sound from her before, when she was small, when she was trying not to cry, but thought crying wasn't the right response to whatever was happening. She was never wrong about it being the right response. She just couldn't always get there. She said, "Can I come to Boise?" I said, "I'll make chili." She came the following weekend, with her husband and my granddaughter, who is 9 now, and who ran through my front door and grabbed me around the waist like no time had passed at all, because for her it hadn't. She was too young to understand the distance between her mother and me, only that sometimes Grandpa wasn't around as much as she wanted him to be. I held on to her for a while. My daughter stood in my hallway and looked around the house she'd never been to, taking in the details the way you do when you're trying to understand a life through its objects. The bookshelves, the framed trail maps on the wall, the photo of her from her college graduation that I'd kept on the mantel even when everything else was gone. She looked at the photo for a long time. She didn't say anything, neither did I. There are things that don't need words, or that words would only diminish. She understood that too, I think. She'd always been smart about the difference between what needed to be said and what needed to be let alone. We ate dinner at my table. My granddaughter told me about her teacher and a project on ecosystems she was working on. My son-in-law talked about a trip they were thinking about taking in the summer, and asked if I might want to come. I said I might. After dinner, my daughter and I sat on the back porch while her husband got my granddaughter ready for bed. It was cold, but we'd brought blankets. The sky was clear the way it is in Boise on a night with no clouds, the kind of clear that makes the stars look improbably close. She said, "What are you going to do with it?" I said I didn't know yet, that it was more money than I knew what to do with, and that I'd spent the last decade learning to live on less, and that I wasn't sure reversing that was something I wanted to rush. She said, "Mom would have hated that answer." I said, "I know." She smiled. It was her mother's smile, the one that shows up when someone has said something true but inconvenient. She said, "I want you to know something. I don't care about the money. I mean it. I don't need it, and I'm not. This isn't about that." I told her I knew. She said, "I just keep thinking about all the time." She stopped, started again. 11 years, and I was so certain. I was so sure I knew what happened. I told her that certainty about the people we love is sometimes the most dangerous kind, that it closes off the questions we should be asking. She was quiet for a while, then she said, "I'm sorry, Dad. It's a short sentence. 2 words that cost a lot. I know what it costs because I've had to say it myself, and I know there's nothing on the other side of it that makes the saying easy." I told her I knew. I told her she didn't need to carry it alone anymore. I told her we had time, not the time we'd lost, that was gone, but the time we still had, which was more than I'd believed possible sitting in a kitchen in Boise eating leftover chili and listening to the radiator knock. She reached over and put her hand over mine. We stayed on the porch until we were both too cold to stay any longer, watching the stars in that Idaho sky, not talking about most of what needed talking about because we didn't need to do it all at once. Some things you unpack slowly over years, in kitchens and phone calls and Sunday mornings. I thought about my ex-wife, about the letter she'd written, the courage it takes to name your own failures clearly, even, especially, when it's too late to undo them. I thought about what she'd said, about not wanting me to carry the weight of not forgiving someone who was no longer there to receive it. She knew me better than I'd given her credit for, even at the end, even after all of it. I think I forgave her somewhere on that back porch, without quite deciding to. The way you forgive someone you shared 23 years with. Not all at once, not with an announcement, just with a loosening of something that had been held tight for so long it had stopped feeling like tension and started feeling like structure. There are things you carry for so long you forget their weight. You think they're just part of how you stand. And then something shifts, and you stand a little differently, and you understand what it had been costing you. I'm 63 years old. I have a daughter who is learning to talk to me again, one phone call at a time. I have a granddaughter who grabs me around the waist like I'm exactly where she expected me to be. I have a small house in Boise with a river I walk along every morning, and bookshelves I've had 11 years to fill. That's what I have. It's enough. It's more than enough. It's, as it turns out, everything.